Given Americans' propensity to moralize about poverty and pretend that social ills, violence, and lawbreaking are something poor people do, though we've seen enough evidence of wealthy people doing it recently, I still admit that I was a little bit hesitant to bring up the question of incarceration as a topic on the quote-unquote other America. But as I think about who the invisible poor are among us, incarceration comes to mind for two other and particular reasons. The first, having visited prisons myself, I have some experience of what an awful, invisible world they are to the rest of us. It's often violent places where we warehouse the poor away and do nothing really to help with rehabilitation. Prisons are another America, a hidden world where hope is difficult to find. And second, as we've alluded to already, when I compare the world of 2012 to Harrington's world of the poor in 1962, one of the most startling differences is the enormous increase in the number of poor people today who are in the criminal justice system, particularly in prison. I don't deny that incarceration has in some ways protected poor people from crime, because violent crime impacts the poor much more readily than it does those of us who are middle class. But I also have come to believe that the system of incarceration and punishment without rehabilitation is one of the surest ways of ensuring and replicating a permanent underclass. It's a topic we have to discuss. I can't think of a better person to bring to do that than Professor Bruce Western, who is Professor of Sociology and Director of the Malcolm Wiener Center for Social Policy at the Harvard Kennedy School of Government. Western's recent work is focused on the link between social inequality and the growth of prison and jail population in the United States. He finds that the penal system has become a more common presence in the lives of Americans, with lasting effects on their life chances. Western's first book, Between Class and Market, Post-War Unionization in the Capitalist Democracies, from Princeton University Press, examined the growth and decline of trade unions in capitalist democracies. In his second book, Punishment and Inequality in America, Western studies the social and economic effects of mass incarceration. Serving time in prison reduces earnings, skews statistics on wages and employment, and destabilizes families. As you'll surmise in a moment, Western is a native of Australia. Before moving to Harvard, he taught at Princeton University from 1993 to 2007, was a Guggenheim Fellow and a Jean Monnet Fellow at the European University Institute from 1995 to 1996. He's an elected Fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. He received the James F. Short Distinguished Article Award for Crime Law in the Deviance section of the American Sociological Association, and Punishment and Inequality in America won the Albert J. Rees Award from the Crime and Law and Deviance section in 2000, and the 2008 Michael J. Hildelang Award for Most Outstanding Contribution to Research on Criminology from the American Society of Criminology. Please join me in welcoming Bruce Western.
Thanks so much, Tom, and thanks for the invitation to speak today and to think about why can't I bring my slides up? There we go. To speak about the ongoing importance of the work of Michael Harrington as we examine the landscape of American poverty in the United States. I'm going to talk today about some work I've been doing over the last 10 years or so on the scope, the consequences of the growth of prison populations in the United States. And I want to talk about this research with Harrington in the background, I think, and I've been trying to think as we approach this conference, trying to think about the relevance of the other America to the problem of contemporary mass incarceration. I think there are really two important, at least two fundamentally important ideas in the other America that are extremely powerful for our understanding of the contemporary significance of the American penal system. As Tom was saying, a fundamental idea in Harrington's analysis of American poverty was its invisibility. Its invisibility in an ideological context that celebrated affluence and opportunity, and its sociological invisibility because it was deeply concentrated in what appeared to be enduringly or permanently poor communities. It didn't really form part of the social experience of the mainstream of American society, and it was a more intractable social problem for that reason. Harrington, of course, also wrote specifically about African American poverty, and it was distinct in his view because, as he said, it was produced by the double indignity of racial discrimination and economic oppression. And we can see this double indignity very palpably in the statistics on mass incarceration. Now, when I think about the penal system in the United States, this is a picture I often have in mind. This was a photograph taken in 2009, I think. This is a state prison in California, in Chino, and this is a gymnasium that has been converted to a housing unit because of conditions of overcrowding in that prison. Of course, the population is all men, largely minority men, and these men are drawn from a relatively small number of very poor neighbourhoods in urban areas in California. Now, this is not a picture, I think, that's really in the forefront of the public discussion about crime and criminal justice in America, coming from Harvard. The picture that we've gotten there, at least over the last year or so, looked less like this and, unfortunately, more like this. And this was, in fact, the celebrated beer summit involving Skip Gates, who was arrested in his home by Sergeant Crowley there, who is next to the president, and Professor Gates, who is in the Afro-American Studies program at Harvard, was coming home from an overseas trip. He couldn't get into his house, and so he forced his way in. A neighbour saw a man forcing his way into his house in Cambridge and called the police. Officer Crowley showed up at the scene and arrested Professor Gates. Media firestorm followed. The president interceded and told us this would be a teachable moment. This would be a teachable moment about race and criminal justice in the United States. Well, we never really got the teachable moment. We did get the photo op of Professor Gates and Sergeant Crowley sharing a beer with the president and the vice president. And unfortunately, I think, this is as deep as our discussion of race and criminal justice often runs in the United States. It's much more a photo op, an opportunity for spectacular, graphic, and sometimes lurid images, but the grinding reality of it and the grinding basis of the American criminal justice system in American poverty is often overlooked. And so that's the purpose of my talk today, to try and understand the connection between those two things. The starting point I want to take is this idea of mass imprisonment or mass incarceration. And this idea, mass imprisonment, was coined by a sociologist, David Garland. And Garland said there are really two parts to this definition of mass imprisonment. And this was his characterization of the US penal system today. It's a system of mass imprisonment. So the first condition that Garland mentions is a rate of imprisonment that's markedly above the historical and comparative norm for societies of this type. He's talking about advanced liberal democracies. So an unusually high rate of imprisonment. That's one characteristic of mass imprisonment. But then he goes on to say, intriguingly, elliptically, but a little vaguely, in addition, mass imprisonment also consists of a rate of incarceration that's so concentrated that we're no longer incarcerating individual offenders, but we're incarcerating whole groups of the population. And for me as a sociologist, this raises an intriguing question, because incarceration now inheres in the group in some sense. We're no longer locking up individuals, we're locking up groups. But there's also a puzzle there. At what point do we stop locking up individuals and cross that threshold to be locking up groups? And so what I want to do is provide some empirical evidence for this idea of mass incarceration and try and bring a little more clarity or a little more precision to this idea of the incarceration of the group rather than the individual. And as you'll see at the end, I think we probably need to reformulate this idea a tiny bit. Okay. So you measured the scale of an incarceration rate. You measured the scale of a penal system in a country with a statistic called an incarceration rate. And that's just the percentage of people who are locked up on any given day. And it's often expressed as a rate per 100,000 of the population. These are incarceration rates in Western Europe. And in most Western European countries, the incarceration rate is about 100 per 100,000. 0.1 of 1% of the population of Western Europe is in prison on any given day. This was the early 2000s. It's about the same now. In the US, the incarceration rate is almost an order of magnitude larger than in Western Europe. In the early 2000s, it was about 686 per 100,000. And today it's somewhat higher. It's it's over 700. So clearly, the US is extremely different from the liberal democracies of Western Europe. More than this, the current period that we're in is historically extremely unusual, even for the United States. And we have data on the scale of imprisonment that goes back to the 1920s. And if we go back to the 1920s and track forward for 50 years, the size of the American penal system remained roughly constant, around 100 per 100,000, the level of incarceration that we currently see in Western Europe. And then in the early 70s, the system began to change. It began to grow. And it grew continuously for the next 30 years. And I think for the last 2 years, there have been small declines registered in the imprisonment rate. And that's the first time that's happened in over 3 decades. So the current period we're in is historically very, very unusual as we look back over the 20th century. What does this mean in terms of numbers? The latest figures say we now have about 1.5 million people in state or federal prison. We have another 780,000 in local jails, and these are people serving shorter sentences or awaiting trial. We have another 800,000 people under community supervision on parole. They've served custodial sentences and they're back out in the community and reporting to a parole officer. And then on top of that, we have another 4.2 million people on probation. And these are mostly people who are serving suspended sentences, meeting with a probation officer in the community. You add all this up and we have over 7 million people in the United States today under some kind of criminal justice supervision. And the point to emphasise, I think, is that this is historically novel. We need only go back 20 years or so in which the scale of the criminal justice system was vastly smaller. Now, as striking as these figures are, this is not the most important thing about the criminal justice system in the United States today. The most important thing about the criminal justice system is its uneven, unequal distribution across the population. And all of the figures I've showed you so far, they're just snapshots at a point in time. So I'm going to show you some statistics now that describe the likelihood that someone would ever serve time in prison in their lives. And we can take different birth cohorts and look at the chances that by age 35, say, you will have served time in prison. Now, I'm just talking about prison incarceration here, and this is really the deep end of the system. Prison incarceration is serving time in a state or federal facility for a felony conviction, 28 months of time served now at the median, and a minimum of 12 months. So this is a very significant period of institutionalisation. My co-author on a lot of this work, Becky Pettit at the University of Washington, and I, we looked at two birth cohorts. First, we looked at a group of men who were born just after World War II. So this is a group of men born 1945 to 49. And we asked, well, what was the likelihood for this birth cohort that they would have gone to prison by 1979, so right at the beginning of the period of the prison boom. And we looked at these lifetime risks of imprisonment for black and white men separately. And we looked at these risks of imprisonment at different levels of education. And for this birth cohort that was born just after World War II, who are reaching their mid-30s by the end of the 1970s, among white men, about 1.2%, we estimated, would ever serve time in prison. Among African American men, the number is about 9%. Now, these figures are steeply stratified by education. Most of the people in prison and jail have very low levels of education. In state prison, the average level of schooling of a person in state prison is about 10 years of education. So on average, a state prisoner is a high school dropout on average. Among African American high school dropouts for this post-war cohort, the chances that they'd have served time in prison is about 15%. If they'd never gone to college, the chances that they'd go to prison at some point in their lives is about 12%, about 1 in 8. And so non-college African American men is about the lower half of the education distribution of black men. So we compared these guys to a birth cohort born in the late 1970s. And in the late 1970s, you're reaching your mid-30s by 2009, at the peak of the prison boom. And so these are the lifetime risks of imprisonment for those men born in the late 1970s. And so among African American men, if they never went to college, and that's about half of them, if they never went to college, the chances are that they would serve time in prison at some point in their lives is over a third. So over a third of all black men born since the 1970s have prison records. If they dropped out of high school, the chances that they've been to prison at some point in their lives is about 70%. So prison time for low education African American men has become a normal life event. And this is very recent, right? We need only go back to this earlier birth cohort born just after World War II to find a time when the penal system was not a ubiquitous presence in the lives of African American men with low levels of schooling. Even among white men who have dropped out of high school, we see very high lifetime risks of prison incarceration. Okay, so this is evidence on the concentration of incarceration in a very narrow segment of the population and a deeply disadvantaged one. Now, sociologists of the life course normally think of the pathway through adulthood as a sequence of stages in which people do things like finish their schooling, get married, serve in the military. These are the events that mark the passageway into adulthood. I would argue, under these conditions of historically high incarceration rates, we need to think about serving time in prison as a significant life event that can profoundly transform one's experience of adulthood. So let me try and illustrate that idea. So here are our white and black men born in the late 1970s, and we're looking at the likelihood that they're going to experience different life course events by 2009. And these are the things we normally look at in life course sociology. What's the likelihood you've ever been married by your mid-30s? What's the likelihood that you've finished college with a 4-year degree or served in the military? In the era of mass incarceration, we can also add what's the likelihood that you've served time in prison. And so this table is telling us that the probability of serving prison time is much higher for African American men than the probability of finishing college with a 4-year degree. The probability of serving prison time is 3 times higher than the probability of serving in the military. The other thing to note from this slide is the racial inequality. So if we just look at the black-white ratio, for imprisonment it's about 5 to 1, and it greatly exceeds the other racial disparities for these other social indicators: marriage rates, college completion, military service, and so on. We could actually look at a whole variety of different social indicators, differences in wages, employment, infant mortality, and none of them would rival the black-white disparity that we see in incarceration rates. It's a very profound inequality, and nothing really distinguishes the collective experience of blacks from whites in America like contact with the criminal justice system. Okay, that's half my story. So what is the significance of all of this? And I'm going to argue to you that this has profound significance for how we think about social inequality in America. The inequality created by incarceration is extremely enduring, very difficult to change through policy measures. It's extremely enduring for 3 specific reasons, and I'm going to elaborate on each of these. It's invisible, and here I think I've been very much influenced by the other America in thinking about the power of invisible inequalities, inequalities that lie outside of our common sense understanding of American society. So the inequality created by incarceration is invisible. It's cumulative. It adds to the disadvantage of those who are already intensely disadvantaged. And it's intergenerational. It affects the children of those who wind up in the penal system. So let me do a little bit of work with each of these 3 ideas: invisible, cumulative, and intergenerational inequality. Invisible inequality. Why is the inequality created by the penal system invisible? It's invisible because incarceration is deeply concentrated in a very small segment of the population, and because penal institutions, by their nature, segregative institutions. They take people out of society and put them in far-flung facilities, often very far from the neighbourhoods from which the prison population originates. And so they're very much hidden from the mainstream of society. Prisons don't form part of our understanding of mainstream social institutions in the United States. We don't think about them. And for sociology, which is interested in documenting social inequality, this creates a really significant challenge, because it means that the inequalities created by the penal system are even overlooked by social scientists who are charged with the problem of studying and documenting social inequality. As a result, inequality is often underestimated. I want to illustrate this idea very simply and briefly. Here's an employment rate. This is employment for African American men under age 35, very low levels of schooling. These are men who have not completed high school. We're looking at the period from 1980 through to 2008. These men were surveyed by the Current Population Survey. And this is the big labour force survey run by the census, used to measure the unemployment rate. And the census routinely reports figures like this on employment in the population. The CPS, the Current Population Survey, used to calculate these figures, is a household survey. So if you have a large fraction of a population that doesn't live in households because they're institutionalised, their economic status will not be counted in assessments of the economic well-being of the population. Okay? So what's this figure telling us? It's telling us that if we just look at American households, there's been a substantial decline in employment among African American high school dropouts. Goes down from about 60% in 1980 down to about 40% by 2005, but it's been pretty flat over the last 15 years. Now, our big innovation was simply to count prison and jail inmates as part of the population. The statistic we're seeing here is an employment to population ratio, but it doesn't count the entire population because it doesn't count people in institutional settings. So what if we counted in the population people in institutional settings? This is what the true employment rate among black high school dropouts looks like. Much larger decline in employment. The entire gap between the two series is attributable to the rising rate of incarceration among black high school dropouts, okay? So if we look at the official statistics, they're telling us that employment in this group is 45%, but the true employment rate is closer to 25%. And the difference between the official statistic and the true number is entirely due to the scale of the penal system. This employment rate of 25% among African American male dropouts is lower, in fact. The employment rate is lower than the incarceration rate for the group. By 2008, the incarceration rate was about 37%. 37% was the incarceration rate for black men who have dropped out of high school under 35. Their employment rate is only 25%. So they're much more likely, these men are much more likely to be in prison or jail than they are to be in paid employment by the end of the aughts, by about 2007, 2008. Okay, that's invisible inequality. The inequality in employment is not fully reflected in our social accounting. Cumulative inequality. Inequality created by incarceration diminishes the status of those whose employment and wages are already extremely low, right? So there's an economic burden associated with having served time in prison, and that burden is concentrated on those who have extremely poor economic opportunities to begin with. How large is the negative effect of incarceration economically on the labour market for those coming out trying to find jobs? Well, we estimate that incarceration reduces earnings, and these are already men who are earning very little to begin with. Incarceration reduces their earnings by about 40%, annual earnings by about 40%, we estimate. There's also experimental evidence where researchers have sent fake job applicants to apply for jobs, and on their resumes they present evidence of a criminal record. Employers do not want to hire, by and large, do not want to hire job seekers with criminal records, and the experimental evidence for that is very strong. Having a criminal record on your resume reduces your success in the labour market by about 50%, and that effect is even larger for African American men compared to whites. Here's a very simple illustration of the effects of incarceration on earnings mobility, the growth of earnings over a 20-year period. Earnings growth is fundamentally important for men's pathway through adulthood. Most of us experience about 2/3 of our earnings growth by our mid-40s, and regular earnings growth, which is produced by continuous employment, allows men to age into a whole variety of pro-social roles, allows them to age into the role of a breadwinner, a provider for a family, and so on. If we look at men in the bottom quintile of the earnings distribution, so the bottom 20% of men, and here we're looking at young men, and we're asking, well, what's the chances that these low-income men will rise out of the bottom quintile 20 years later? And if they've never been incarcerated, a low-income man has about 2/3 chance of rising out of the bottom income quintile over a 20-year period. If they got a low cognitive test score, the AFQT is the Armed Forces Qualifying Test, and survey data we're looking at gave all the survey respondents this test. If they got a low cognitive test score, the chances that they would experience upward mobility in their lifetime is about 40%. If they dropped out of high school, the chances of upward mobility are about a third. A third would rise up out of the bottom quintile. If they were incarcerated, 75% of those men would stay in the low-income quintile over 20 years. Their earnings just don't grow at all. Okay, last part, intergenerational inequality. Large prison populations means large numbers of kids with parents in prison. There's a very active area of research now. The stigma of incarceration for children is proving to have a whole variety of negative effects on kids' academic achievement, on their behaviour. There's new research showing that following incarceration of a parent, kids are showing up with depressive symptoms, more aggressive behaviour. These effects seem to be concentrated among boys, interestingly. Very active area of research, and still a lot of work to be done to fully understand the effects of parental incarceration on children. I want to just illustrate the scale of the problem very simply by just looking at the number of kids who have a parent in prison. If we look at Hispanic kids, by 2007, we estimate about 500,000 of them, 500,000 Hispanic kids had a parent either in prison or jail by 2008. If we look at white kids, the number's about 700,000. 700,000 white kids had a parent in prison or jail in 2008. If we look at African American kids, the number's about 1.2 million. about 1.2 million African American children currently have a parent behind bars. That's about 11% of all African American children right now have a parent either in prison or jail. If we look at kids born in 1990, about a quarter of those children will have their father sent to prison, will see their father sent to prison by the time they reach their 14th birthday. Okay, mass incarceration, that's where we started, right? And so what can we say, having looked at this evidence now, this empirical evidence, what can we say about this idea of mass incarceration? I want to slightly reformulate David Garland's original definition that we began with. And I would reformulate it this way. When incarceration rates are very high, historically high as we've seen, very narrowly concentrated in an already deeply disadvantaged segment of the population, and when incarceration has large and enduring effects on social and economic inequality, when these conditions are obtaining. And why are the effects enduring? The effects are enduring because incarceration is invisible, cumulative and intergenerational. When these conditions obtain, mass incarceration has produced a new social group, really, in society that is separated from all of the opportunity and potential that American society provides. Their social experience is wholly different from the social mainstream, and their relationship to the American state is fundamentally different from all others in society. So mass incarceration is actively implicated in the production of a new social group that is, in fact, deeply and enduringly disadvantaged. Now, I could stop the talk there, but I think we have to ask, well, what do we do about this, right? We can't stop the talk there. And we're at a very interesting historical time. And it's precipitated to a significant degree by the financial crisis because the states are broke and they want to cut correctional spending. And so a political opportunity has opened over the last 2 or 3 years. For the first time in over 3 decades, there is political will for rolling back these very large prison populations. But it remains a very open-ended question. And I think the question for us is, what is the problem that we ultimately want to solve? Is the problem high imprisonment rates? Is that the problem that we would want to solve as this political opportunity is open? And I would say no, in fact. That's not the problem we want to solve. The problem that we want to solve is the chronic idleness, untreated addiction, untreated mental health problems that are concentrated among whom? Among young men with very little schooling. This is a group for which there is no social safety net. Okay? The American welfare state is overwhelmingly focused on, to the extent it exists at all, it's overwhelmingly focused on the elderly and poor single mothers and their children. For this group, there is no social safety net, and the penal system emerged as a solution, in a sense, to the absence of social policy and these social problems. The discussion we're having about criminal justice reform right now, and there is a very active one, is too narrow, I worry, because if we focus just on the problem of criminal justice reform itself, without treating the problems of unemployment, untreated addiction, untreated mental health problems among this very deeply disadvantaged group of young men, if we focus just on criminal justice reforms, it won't be enough, right? And the reform effort will have failed and reform will be discredited. So I think we need to have a broader conversation about what an alternative to mass incarceration looks like that vitally implicates social policy that addresses these problems. 4 quick steps, then I'll finish because I'm eager to hear from our other panellists. Research. There is an opportunity for researchers to contribute to this public discussion. Every time I hear Tim talk, I'm blown away by his work, and he is doing profoundly important work in this area, I think. So we need to understand better the social consequences of incarceration, the social costs of incarceration. We need to look at the cases of success where incarceration rates have been enduringly reduced. New York State is very important here. Prison populations in New York have been in decline for over a decade now, and crime has continued to fall. We need to do sentencing reform, and this is possible now for the first time. And the place to start is drug sentencing. There's a political opportunity and openness among lawmakers and in public opinion to reduce drug sentences. And California is a very important case here. Marijuana is effectively decriminalised in California now. Reentry. We can't focus all our efforts on the front end. This is a massive system that took 30 years to grow. We have to think about what's happening to the people who are returning to their communities and leaving their institutions. What I think we need is a national prisoner reentry program. There are faint outlines of this, and the Congress is attuned to this problem. They're looking at things like parole reform. Transitional employment, I think, is fundamentally important and evaluates very well. We need a massive expansion of prison education too. As the penal system grew, educational programming shrunk. The final piece is politics. I wish it started with R. I'll have to think of an alliteration there. But this won't happen without politics. And the large organisations of progressive politics in the United States have not embraced this issue. It's an enormously politically difficult issue for the civil rights establishment, as Michelle Alexander has written about. It's an enormously difficult political issue for the labour movement, which was Michael Harrington's vehicle for the eradication of poverty. But without broad political support and a real organisational effort, the reform opportunity will be lost, and it's up to these large and established organisations really to grasp this nettle. It's fundamentally about the public safety and security and justice for poor communities, and this is the core mission of these organisations, so this should be right in their wheelhouse. Let me stop there because I want to hear from our panellists and hear from you all as well. Thanks very much.